Hannah Murray on TRE in the afternoon.
Joining us on the line now is Anita Slominska. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the Research Institute of the McGill University Heath Centre. Her book, OtherEndings, Organ Transplantations and the Burdens of Hope, is a powerful mix of memoir and medical inquiry, exploring transplant waitlist ethics and mortality. In the book, Anita recounts her sister Shauna's 18-month wait for a liver transplant that failed to take place in time to save her life. Welcome to the show, Anita.
Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm so sorry to hear about your sister. That's just so tragic.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Yeah, it was really hard, actually. It was a really hard experience.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. She was just 29, I understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she was 29 and she was ill since she was a child. And so it was just kind of really unexpected that she was going to die so young. And it was just hard to process that.
Yeah, of course. So how does it work in America? Because with organ transplants and wait lists, I know it can differ very much from country to country. We're based in Spain, and obviously a lot of our listeners are in the UK. And even from those two countries, I believe it's different. So how does it work there?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So, I mean, I think that some of the processes of kind of getting on a wait list are similar, but I think, there's a very large difference between what happens in North America and in Spain, just in terms of how kind of hospitals operate to kind of facilitate organ donation, which is why I think Spain has one of the highest rates of organ donation and transplantation compared to other places. I think that there's a lot of, issues around, who's getting prioritized, but then also what organs are available, because one of the interesting things that happened to my sister was that she did receive offers for an organ. She was at the top of the list and she did receive offers, but I think because the quality of the organs was just not good enough, they have to kind of evaluate whether organs are viable for transplant before they can be transplanted. And so I think that's a significant issue also, that impacts who is getting transplanted and who's not. It just kind of depends on what organs are available, at the time that you need them.
Yeah. Something that was interesting that really opened my eyes a few weeks ago. I was interviewing a funeral director over here, and he was explaining how organ donation works in Spain and how a lot of people sort of flippantly say, oh, when I die, you can have my organs. And he was explaining, no, after you've died, it's too late to give away your organs. I think a lot of people have that misinformation in their head that they're quite happy for their organs to be donated after they've died. And he was making a really extremely interesting point and saying that no, the point of organ donation has to happen when a person is still alive. So like in a coma situation, it's a very tricky, sensitive time, obviously, for everybody, all the families involved. So presumably that's the case all over. That's always going to be the case. That's not ethics. That's just medical, how it works.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because that was also a revelation that I had after my sister had died. I actually never really realized that, you don't just die and you can't just choose that you want to donate your organs when you die. You have to die under very particular circumstances. Yeah. That you can have the opportunity to donate your organs. And so that was kind of eye-opening for me because it just showed me what the scarcity of organs really means. And it has much less to do with kind of public willingness or even acceptability around the idea. Like, I think a lot of people, as you were saying in your conversation with this funeral director, it's like, well, if I'm dead, I don't need my organs. So you might as well use them if someone else can use them. But yeah, it's a lot more complicated than that. And I think you're absolutely right that a lot of people don't realize that there's this very kind of simplistic way of thinking about organ donation and transplantation. And I certainly had that myself as I was going through this experience with my sister. And I think it was only after the fact that I realized how much I didn't know and understand about what was actually going on.
Yeah. And it's not an easy decision for the so for the family members who are sitting there with a loved one who is effectively dying. Some people would think for various reasons that it would be a wonderful legacy for them and their family and their loved one to be able to donate their loved one's organs to somebody else to give them a chance of life. It's a beautiful thing to be able to do. But other people, also for valid reasons, would think, no, I don't want them cutting up my loved one. It's a very personal thing, isn't it? It's really not an easy, simple, black and white decision for people.
No, I don't think so. And I think because, a lot of people who are viable organ donors maybe have kind of tragic deaths, sudden deaths. And so the family is still kind of just processing like losing someone, and I think it's hard to quickly move into making a decision around organ donation when you're just processing your grief or processing just the shock of someone dying. So, yeah, it's really complicated. And I think it's like it takes very skilled, I think, professionals who work in kind of on the donation side to be able to have those conversations with families and stuff like that, because it's not maybe as, it's just like a simple decision that it may seem when you're not in the moment.
Yeah, for sure. So can you tell us a bit more about what happened with your sister then?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, she was diagnosed with an autoimmune liver disease when she was a child. And so it just kind of progressed, like it didn't seem very catastrophic when she was younger. And we had heard, that, probably eventually she would need a liver transplant. And so I just kind of accepted that as her eventual reality. And I never questioned whether or not it was really going to take place or not. To my mind, it was going to happen. And so then when she was made active on a liver transplant list, I was very optimistic. I was very hopeful. I thought, okay, this is going to happen. And then I think, and in some cases, I think this is, I don't know about other organs, but in liver transplant or liver disease, end-stage liver disease, things can kind of quickly go downhill, where there can be a pretty kind of sharp decline in the patient's health. And so that's kind of what happened to my sister, that she just got really, really sick, really, really fast. And that, I think, was not something we were prepared for either. And so it just, she ended up being in an ICU for almost 2 weeks at the end of her life on life support, where we were still hoping that, maybe the right liver will become available and this transplant will still happen. So we were really hanging on to this kind of, the happy ending story. The transplants are a miracle story. And so, and then it just all of a sudden, the doctors decided that it wasn't viable, the idea of doing a transplant. She was too unwell, and so life support was removed, and she died. And that was, it was just kind of it just was something that I wasn't expecting or wasn't prepared for, even though it was a strange thing because it was happening before our eyes. Like we could see how ill she was, and she was, but it just never, I always thought that there was going to be a successful kind of transplant at the end.
Yeah,
so,
of course. And I mean, did the doctors over the years not prepare you and not kind of say, just so you know, this might not happen. This is what we want to happen. This is what we hope is going to happen, but it's not guaranteed.
So this is interesting because I want to say no, we weren't prepared. That there is this kind of push towards being optimistic and this kind of whole atmosphere. I think that's present in transplantation as a field, but also in Western biomedicine as a whole. This idea that, these medical technologies are amazing and things are going to work, and we can kind of intervene in such a way that we can avoid death, and that this kind of death avoidance, not talking about mortality. There's been really a lot of interesting work done around that, the way that mortality is not something that's often really addressed very openly in medicine. And so I think there was an avoidance of that topic. We avoided it, like the family and friends and everyone who wanted to see Shauna survive. We avoided thinking about it because it was too painful. But I think there's also this kind of culture in the hospital of not wanting to openly acknowledge the possibility of dying. And that's something that I also wanted to highlight in writing this book also, because I think that's something that maybe should change or maybe should be a little bit different, and that there is, on the one hand, everybody wants to be optimistic and think that, that things are going to work out. But then that can create a bit of a difficult kind of situation for people to process grief then when things don't work out. And I think this is the case in many kind of illness contexts.
Yeah. I think sometimes it can happen the other way with doctors. Sometimes, around things like cancer or things that could be really serious and life-threatening, or things that can be sorted relatively easy with an operation or some treatment or whatever. And sometimes the doctors give you the worst scenario. Sometimes they'll say, so this could happen, and it all feels a bit frightening and scary. And, the C word is scary anyway when it comes to health. Whenever anyone's diagnosed with cancer, it's automatically a frightening word to hear. And I think very often they normally give you the worst scenario first. So it's interesting that doesn't happen with organ transplants necessarily.
Well, and that's, that is a really good point, that there is this, and maybe there's difference in, communication styles. But there is, I think, one of the things that make organ transplantation very particular is that I think for a long time, there's been this sense that to kind of promote organ donation, and public support for organ donation, we kind of have to highlight the happy stories, because this idea that somehow if you donate your organ, and then this kind of dominant transplant narrative is, someone who's sick, and then there's this generous act, and then everything is all better. And so I think because organ transplantation has, is unique for that reason, that it relies on the, donors, the need for donors, that I think that can maybe shift narratives around transplantation into maybe something that is more positive. I think the positive message or the positive story, so that it makes organ donation seem worthwhile, and that instead of this idea that, there can be poor outcomes after transplant, they don't always work, or, the kind of negative stories aren't heard as much. And so I think that can affect patient and family expectations, because this is what they see. This is kind of the public facing organ transplantation story. And of course, people want to be hopeful and optimistic also. That's kind of it feels better. Yeah. And also encouraged to be hopeful and optimistic. And so I think that's, when your life is depending on receiving an organ, I think there is encouragement to be hopeful about it, instead of being pessimistic about it.
No, of course. And I'm interested to know how the priority list works. I mean, I know I have a relative in the UK that's has been on dialysis for his kidney for many, many years. So he is on some kind of wait list to get a kidney transplant, but he's not in a life-threatening condition. So, that's why he's been on the wait list for years, and he's presumably nowhere near the top, because he's not in hospital, and his condition's being managed with dialysis. And there'll obviously be lots of people in a similar situation. How do you know how the priority list works? I mean, presumably the more serious the condition is, up they go. But I mean, when you're in America, for example, it's a large country. How big is the parameter into how soon an organ can be transported to a patient that needs it urgently?
Yeah, no, there's a lot. So there's the prioritization of the patient. And in the case of liver transplant, they use an algorithm that just uses different indicators like that you can that are from a blood test. So like to test liver function, kidney function, blood clot time, all these things, and that you're given a number that's between 0 and 40. So they actually rank people according to what's considered to be these kind of objective criteria that is it's a formula that's meant to predict your likelihood of dying within the next 3 months. So they have this system that's been criticized, and I write about this too in my book, that it maybe doesn't really universally capture disease severity in all cases with all patients. So this is something that's very kind of interesting to me, this kind of shift towards wanting to just use objective criteria to make very critical medical decisions. And that's kind of the dominant way of doing things in medicine right now. But then, with the distribution too, they have to make sure that typically organs just have to stay within the same region. Because of that, you can't lose time in transportation. And so that can create some regional disparities too on who has more access to organs versus other people. So there's both of those things that are in play. And so, so it's stressful for patients, I think, to kind of feel like there's so much that's up to chance also. I think it's like, and I think with the way that they have it now, it's like the length of time that you've waited for an organ no longer counts in terms of your priority. They just want to make sure that what they call it the sickest first policy. So whoever they determine to be the sickest should have access. But I think it's highly variable. And I think because of all of these logistical issues that complicate it too, it's not, this is why I think some people fall through the cracks. So it's hard. It's hard to manage and it's hard to make sure that the people who really need the organs are getting them.
Yeah, it must be very difficult to manage. Like you said, your sister's condition, and also with liver disease in general, it can change and go downhill very quickly. So someone might not be near the top of the list one day, and the next day suddenly they are, and there's already 4, 5, 10 other people that are at the top of the list. I mean, goodness knows the person who's trying to deal with the logistics of it all, but it must be an incredibly stressful, difficult job.
Yeah, for sure. And there's even logistical things like availability of operating rooms and surgeons. And, it's just like, is the personnel there? It's very complicated. That leads to, sometimes decisions are made that maybe don't seem logical, but they happen for a reason, because this is kind of how things worked out under these circumstances. But It is hard. It's hard to kind of look. That's one thing that I really struggled with looking back, because it just seemed so unfair to me that I was just kind of overwhelmed with this sense, like, this is so unfair that my sister didn't get a transplant, and that she ought to have, or she should have. But when you really look at what's really happening on the ground, how these decisions are really made, then all of a sudden it doesn't seem that unexpected that something like that would happen. So I think it's not, I think it's just how things work, and it's hard to know how to improve. I think one of the major preoccupations has been making it equitable as possible, and how to make sure that there is equity in the system. So.
Yeah. It's very difficult. They're two separate things, aren't they? It's one thing to take a step back from your personal situation and understand how complicated it is and what a tough job all these people are doing. But then from the other side, it's very personal to you and very unfair and very unjust and very sad what's happened, So I think you're amazing to be able to look at the situation objectively.
Well, it took a long time. I mean, this happened almost 20 years ago. So initially I wasn't able to consider it, in that way, just over time, and that I felt more ready to kind of look into it and to do research in and around it, because it's true. Like when you're in the thick of just, processing your own emotions, it's hard to really see the bigger picture and to understand it from a much wider perspective. And so, I was interested in doing that, because I think it's important also then to kind of inject this kind of maybe like bigger, less or more just kind of bigger picture kind of systems approach, but to inject that with a personal story too, and to see how the two interact, I think is very important just, I think, for also, as much as I was writing for people who are in transplant and working in transplant, just to make sure that they kind of understand too the personal stories that are happening, because sometimes those can get lost, I think, or that they're not necessarily at the forefront.
Yeah, absolutely. Well done for writing this book. It's amazing to get both your story out there, Shauna's story out there, and also the story in general of transplants and how they work. And yeah, really important. If people want to get a copy of the book, it's called OtherEndings, Organ Transplantation and the Burdens of Hope. It's available on our website, tre.radio, and it's by Anita Slominska, who we've been chatting with today. Anita, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me.